I don't know what to do. So this is my presentation.
Can't see anything. Ah, there we go. Yeah.
And so like, if I go to presentation, slideshow, slideshow. I forgot how to do this in PowerPoint. Funny. From beginning. Yeah, see, now I can't really see anything apart from my screen. So I don't know how to do like what to do.
But I can still see people even when I'm presenting.
Yeah, I can see people. So I can't see, I can see you guys, but I can't see like chat or anything.
But isn't there a bar at the top for you?
It says stop share and like you are, oh, okay.
Wait, let
It's
me
when I
send
go
you
there.
a chat. Yeah.
Do
Okay,
it.
so
Do it.
Okay, do you see it?
No.
You see like
I see it in more, but I don't really like see it because I can see that there is a chat. I can't see what it is.
Right.
Anyway.
But it's still better because then it looks clean, right? Then
yeah. Okay, what was I doing last? Go away.
Taking some notes out. It's like,
yeah, I was just doing like this last minute notes because I'm an idiot and I didn't do it earlier. And I forgot really, that's what happened. Surbi, are you talking about labor?
Yes, so I'm gonna not talk about anything else. I mean, no, I'm gonna talk about development and labor and informality as an example.
Okay, I'm gonna flag it and then I'm gonna not elaborate on it because I put it in my slides, but then I won't elaborate on it. I'll leave it to you.
But if you talk about it, that's okay. I can just pick up from where you leave and kind of just develop on that. So I'm okay.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, because basically I'm just going to talk about informality and not in terms that you're talking about, but more in the fact that like we don't really discuss it when we're talking about unemployment, and perhaps that's something we should do. You know,
right?
That's really pretty much what I'm going to be saying, just as an example.
Yeah, that's good. I can actually build up on that when I go to mine.
So you can build up on that.
Cool.
Wait, so just send you guys my presentation in case I can't share. If I have any problem, then you guys have an anyway. I send it now, so perhaps it's not gonna take a little while.
Okay.
But I'm gonna test now. Can I test just to be sure it's working?
Yeah.
Just,
Okay, I am back, and looks like you guys are going through of sharing your screen, and all looks good on my side.
Yeah, can you all
Thank you.
see? Okay, great.
Yep,
you can see.
Great.
Okay, I'm gonna try as well, just to make
Yeah,
sure.
do it. What is the problem? Everything.
Full screen. Okay. Oh no, sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front.
I can't see it. I only see a blank screen.
Oh, it's so weird. This has happened before. Resume share. Let me see.
Try it again.
This happened when I did the Hickel slides for some reason.
Do it.
Let me try again. Because I select the PDF. Is that the problem, or should I just do the desktop maybe?
I mean, I'm not sure, but sometimes like it allows you to pick which screen. I can see it now.
Now you can see it.
Yeah, now I can see it.
That's so weird. I wonder what was the problem earlier. Okay, cool. So then that works anyway.
Oh, you have all our names. Oh, yay.
Oh yeah, I didn't add that. I should have. I just said the Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics somewhere, but yeah.
Actually, I'm just gonna do that.
Yeah, me too.
Decon? Or the, yeah.
I'm adding your names.
No. Yeah, me too.
Oh, nice.
Carolina, Elvis, alphabetically, then is Surbi.
Surbi, is it Kesar? Is that right?
Kesar.
Kesar. Okay.
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, 5 minutes to go.
Hmm.
Okay, I think I mostly have a handle on it.
Yeah, I mean, we know this stuff, right? So it's just, we don't
Yeah,
know.
it's more that like I just want to be prepared for like, you know, like good examples. And it's like we know them, but you know, when I'm flustered, like can't really suddenly like bring them to fore. Oh hey Carol, are you talking about like that Adam Smith example about how, oh sorry. she's in the middle of thinking. Are you talking about the pin factory example and that it's not supposed to be the Adam Smith, or did we find that source? We didn't find that source, right?
I'm not talking about saying, I don't have any examples in mind anymore.
Okay. Yeah, no, but it's okay. I mean, I wanted to use that as an example, but I don't think I looked at like our notes and I don't think we found the source for that yet. So I'm just gonna leave it out.
I think Amir tweeted about the source. Perhaps you can
Yeah, Amir tweeted about it, but it's okay. I need to calm down now. So.
Oh, it's not the moment you want to go searching on Twitter.
Yeah. Surbi, do you want to stress test your screen?
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay. All right. So this is fine, right?
Yep. Yeah, so
Okay,
I took something out, like sent you guys at the beginning in our book, mentioned decon, obviously, and the thing tomorrow.
Yeah, I think tomorrow.
And then, yeah.
I was wondering if any of you has the slide of Decon at the end to join or something. Perhaps you, Ingrid, who is the last one.
Yeah, I can probably have time to do that now. I don't have it, but I can add it. Yeah.
I can send you.
Carol, your voice is like low. The volume of your voice is low.
Mine.
Yeah.
I don't have a mic. I just have. I mean, I'm almost. Is it better? No.
Yeah, I guess you should just be like a little louder.
Yeah, you're very loud.
Do you? Hi, this is John. Do you have headsets? Maybe could that help?
I don't have headsets.
Okay. Oh yeah, I think the recommendations we just have a little bit louder in volume than your natural voice.
Okay. Sorry.
And we're about 2 minutes away, so I will let you all get started, and I'll be monitoring the entire program. So if there are any technical issues that come up, I'll be here to assist. And again, always feel free to I'll monitor the chat box as well. I will, as I mentioned, I'll give you a 10-minute warning and a 5-minute warning, and then a 2-minute warning before noon Eastern time.
And you'll say that you'll just put it in the chat?
I'll put it in the chat so you all see it. Would you
Okay.
like me to say it? I just don't want to, would hate to interrupt. I'm good at it. I can kind of nicely become the voice of God if you would like me to do that.
I think maybe because I think we're all going to do like full screen when we share. So then we won't see the chat as easily.
Okay.
It'd be better if you could just like interrupt.
I'll monitor
Plus,
and just let you know the voice of God may interrupt. I'll try not to interrupt anyone, but I may jump in really quickly and let you all know how much time is left in the program.
Yeah, plus by that time we should also like, we won't be sharing screens anyway. We'd have discussion full on. We plan to finish like sharing screens by then. But still, just in case, feel free to like step
All
in.
right.
Yeah,
Good.
just in case.
We're aiming for like 15 to 20 minutes each.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, enjoy. Have fun, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ingrid, I just sent you a presentation that has a slide on Decon. Is the third one. I just couldn't send in a chat, so I'm sending you by email.
Perfect. Then I'll just do that when one of you are presenting.
Okay, gotta get my stopwatch ready.
So people get
15
in
minutes.
3, I guess.
What?
People start entering at 3, I guess, or whatever time.
Yeah. 10 a.m. Eastern, so that's in a minute. Yeah.
Oh, Ingrid, I don't have it for this session. So what we were thinking about the bootleg and stuff. So I'm going to do that for the next one. Oh, we're live.
Oh, we're live. Okay.
You're recording that? The audio?
Yes.
So we'll just give people 10 seconds to get in, and then we'll welcome you. This is great. People are ticking in. So welcome everyone to the ASSA and to URPE. So we're incredibly happy to be here with you all today, and we believe this is a topic that is just as relevant for both mainstream and heterodox audiences. So we're very happy to have it at the parallel ASSA and URPE. The session is on Decolonizing Economics, a guide to theory and practice. And I'm here today with Devika Dutt, who is a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst in the US, and Carolina Alves, who is a Joan Robinson Fellow in Heterodox Economics at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and Serbi Kesar, who is an assistant professor of economics at Azim Premji University in India. And my name is Ingrid Harvold Kvangraven. I'm a lecturer in international development at the University of York in the UK. So today we're going to be scrutinizing the economics field and profession to unpack and explore the colonial roots and what kind of efforts that can be made to diversify and decolonize the field. As you may know, the moves to diversify and decolonize have been going on across the social and natural sciences for many decades, but the economics field has been lagging behind. So it's only recently that the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements have forced the field to start taking sexism and racism more seriously. But even now, it's rare to see that economists acknowledge any reason to explore colonial, racist, and sexist characteristics of economic theory and methodology itself. So this is where we would like to intervene and draw attention to the fundamental historical and structural problems with the economics field, including the development of economic theory. So collectively, the four of us here are writing a book on decolonizing economics, which will come out in the Polity Press series on decolonizing the curriculum. And we really welcome feedback on our ideas and research at this stage, given that this is very much an emerging research agenda. And we're really looking forward to the discussion. We're also a part of and founders of an initiative called Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, or DECON. We'll put the link to the website in the chat, which was launched last year. No, 2 years ago, 2019. And DECON actually has a session tomorrow that I want to draw your attention to called Diversity in Heterodox Economics, Radical Solutions for an Old Problem, which is featuring amazing scholars who come at this question from different perspectives, including Lee Badgett, Nina Banks, Lynn Chester, Jayati Ghosh, Linwood Tawhid, and Sabello and Lovo Getcheni. So if you like what you hear today and you want more, we'd recommend that you also try to attend that panel. Hanna Szymborska will be chairing that panel along with Ariana Agun-Soye and myself. So back to today. The guiding questions for our panel are, first, does economics need to be decolonized? If so, what does decolonization mean for the field, politically, historically, epistemologically, and practically? And second, what are the existing and potential policy efforts towards reforming economics to make it more inclusive in terms of addressing racism and sexism and Eurocentrism? So Devika will present on the decolonization and diversity agendas in economics and the differences between them, laying the ground for the following presentations as well. And Carolina will present on the colonization of economics by exploring how economics is shaped by the historical and political context in which it is shaped and developed. And Serbi will present on what gets lost in Eurocentric understandings of economics by providing insights from a decolonized economics. And finally, I'll present on what kinds of practical steps we can take as economists and academics to decolonize the field, its structures, and the way we teach it, So we're going to be presenting for about 15 to 20 minutes each, so that we keep a good chunk of time at the end for discussion. So please feel free to put the questions in the Q&A box at any time during the discussion, and then we'll collect them towards the end to make sure we address all of them. And so without further ado, I'll give the floor to Devika.
Thank you, Ingrid. I'm just going to start sharing my screen so that we can see my presentation. Okay. Share screen. And we can go into full screen mode. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on our panel, which is about our new book, as Ingrid mentioned, which should be coming out later this year. I'm very glad to introduce what this and set up the problem and what part of the problems that motivated us to start our organization and start writing this book. So I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of things, and I'm going to discuss, as Ingrid mentioned, there's been several efforts to improve diversity in our discipline. And typically, a lot of times, it's not clear what we mean by decolonization of economics. So I'm going to try to define these things in as clear a manner as possible. So I'm going to get right into it. So to contrast the two, the diversity problem in economics is increasingly evident, and I'm not going to spend time giving you stats and figures about it. If we want, there's plenty of stats and figures on our website, so please refer to that. As a result, there are many organizations, movements calling for and working towards greater inclusion and representation in economics. These are just some of them. The Diversifying Economic Quality, it's a wiki for educators and departments to find resources about how to improve diversity in their respective departments and in their practices. The Black Economists Network is a network of Black economists, and they're primarily based in the UK. Bahujan economists, they're a new group that just started this year who seek to improve caste representation in the discipline. The Women in Economics Initiative is another one. The Sadie Collective has been doing very important work to bring to fore the work of Black economists, and specifically Black women economists. And as Ingrid mentioned, our organization has also been working on this front, which is diversifying and decolonizing economics. Now, of course, all these organizations, they seek to address poor gender and racial representation. And but in addition to that, there's also poor representation of economists from, and more importantly, based in global South countries. A lot of economists who come from global South countries have to migrate to global North countries in order to actually be part of the discipline in a meaningful way. And there's very little representation of economists that are actually still based in the global South. And I guess from a diversity perspective, it's important to increase the numbers of these economists in the broader discipline. And I think it's important regardless of like any other motive from a justice point of view. But is that enough? And we argue that it's not enough. In fact, like what we need is diversity and decolonizing. In the non-economic social sciences, decolonize has become a bit of a buzzword, often used to advocate for greater diversity, what I was talking about in terms of increasing the number of people who are coming from global South or developing countries in their respective discipline or their curriculums. But crucially, diversity is not the same as decolonization. Because the lack of diversity of these economists, and in fact also gender and racial diversity, are manifestations of larger structural problems of colonization in the discipline that manifest in many ways. Now, Carolina will talk more about like how this came about, but what it manifests today is in many ways. The people in the discipline and where they're based, the institutions of academic and policy economics, and the theoretical frameworks of economics, which is a great place to discuss this, given that we're a panel of the Union of Radical Political Economics. But yeah, the lack of adequate pluralism in theoretical frameworks in the top of the field is a big problem and part of the problem of colonization. Adding more non-white and non-Western scholars is challenging and important in itself, but it's simply not enough. In fact, adding more people and just that leave the institutions and practices and theories intact will not in fact change the fundamental way in which the discipline operates. Furthermore, the the efforts to improve diversity in this way would be necessarily hamstrung, and we'll be trying to like do this with one arm tied behind our back if we don't address the structural features which have produced this problem in the first place. These are interconnected problems, and we can't do one without the other. So that's why we need to do both. And so how it manifests in the discipline is that, first off, talking about people and location. The historical processes of colonialism and imperialism have led to the limited understanding of what counts as expertise and whose training is acceptable. For example, if you're talking about the discipline at large and what is widely considered the pinnacle of achievement in economics, I guess, all the Nobel Prize, or the Nobel Prize. All recipients of Nobel prizes have received their PhD in a handful of institutions in the US and Western Europe. Globally, all top-rated economics departments are located in the global north. Furthermore, most of the top journals are located and have editors from US universities or universities in Western Europe, but primarily in US universities. Now, we can argue that this could just be because, oh, there's just better research happening there. However, it's really difficult to make that argument when either we're saying is that research happening anywhere outside of US, UK, or in Western Europe is just not good enough, or that there's a systemic colonial bias of what counts as good in the top of the profession, and that's what we're trying to shed light on. There's Western centrism in the institution of economics. Let's give the example of journals. And again, I'm picking up a few examples because it's a very vast field and you can read more about it in our book. But for instance, you can see that we now know from work done by other people that journal publications are strongly, oh, this is in the way, sorry, I can't read my own slides, are strongly linked to connections with the editor. In fact, in their paper in 2018, Colucci finds that 70% of editors of 31 most cited journals in economics come from institutions in the United States, which I mentioned previously. 43% of articles published in a 6-year period that they measure are written by people socially connected to the editors. This includes former graduate students, faculty colleagues, and a third of the authors are supervised by those who are either existing journal editors or become journal editors. We also know that top 5 journals have a strong influence on tenure and promotion, and people most likely to publish in these journals come from top 5 economics department, therefore creating like a vicious cycle. In fact, in this paper, Heckman and Mukhtan, this has become a big problem now because they argue that tenure is dependent on publishing in these journals, and publishing in these journals is dependent on coming from a particular institution. In addition to that, there's also a systemic undervaluation of journals outside the global north. I challenge everybody here to think of journals that you have read, papers that you actively peruse from journals outside of like the US, UK, etc., and Western Europe. I challenge everyone to think of them. And there, of course, are plenty of journals, but we also have heard anecdotal evidence of systemically undervaluation of these journals. For instance, Economic and Political Weekly is a prominent journal in India. It's peer-reviewed, but at the same time, publishing in EPW in a lot of top economics departments is not considered. Does not count towards your tenure decision, which is an example of the systemic undervaluation of these journals. The topic of publication in top 5 journals is also biased towards the global north. This map, which I've put here, is from the study done by Das et al. In 2013. And it shows this map is looking at the topic of papers published in the American Economic Review over a certain period of time, and you can see in this they account for availability of data, and they find that the likelihood of publishing in these journals is the probability of publishing in these journals is much higher if you're writing on the US. The AER has published 1 paper on India every 2 years and 1 paper on Thailand every 20 years. Now, of course, this is a paper from 2013, but like there's very little reason to believe that this trend has changed, and this trend extends to the top 5. Okay, going forth. The institutions of economics, again, another example, just this conference. Yes, this is the conference of the American Economic Association. Yes, it's supposed to be happening in Chicago. However, the fact of the matter is that even to all ASSAs, there's a large number of people who come from all over the world. This is definitely not only a conference for economists who are in USU institutions. People come from all over the world to attend this conference. And even though this time the conference has gone online, yet it's highly inconvenient for people from some parts of the world to attend this conference. For instance, I'm at the moment, even though I'm based at UMass professionally. Presently, I'm in Delhi. You can see this panel started at 8:30. Some of our panels will start much later, and I would simply not be able to attend these panels, even though I did register to pay, and I want to attend this conference. However, it's simply not feasible for me to attend this conference. Even in the virtual format, it was not, it perhaps was part of the calculation, but perhaps it wasn't done enough. And the result of it is that a lot of people who would in normal circumstances actually fly into the US to attend this conference are excluded, even though video conferences should allow us to actually expand the number of people who can actually attend. Going forward, the Western centrism and theoretical approach. Alternative theoretical approaches offer a much better understanding of various issues, and the discipline needs to take that into account. And it systemically doesn't, especially in top journals. There's definitely not a systemic underrepresentation of heterodox economics or economics outside the marginalist tradition. And in fact, another example of how this manifests is I've been to several ASSAs, and typically URPE panels, which is our ASE panels, are hidden in a separate hotel from the ones that happen from the AEA panels. And usually there's very little overlap. Very little people who attend the AEA panels rarely come to the URPE panels, and people who attend the URPE panels typically go back and forth. Is my experience. Of course, I could be wrong. However, it's usually the case that it's definitely we're separate in a separate hotel, probably in a basement, which was the case in Atlanta. So yeah, there's very little overlap. But apart from that, coming back to like journals, there's a systemic undervaluation of heterodox economics and marginalization. However, heterodox economics is a natural starting point to tackle the problems of colonization and exclusion in economics, given the embrace of ideas and approaches that are not consistent with a historical, individual, and rational man starting point of mainstream economics. For instance, when we talk about unemployment, it considers structural factors. In fact, Marx and Kaletsky typically talk about political economy factors of unemployment when you're talking about the gendered labor force and discrimination and wage outcomes and income outcomes of the different genders. Feminist economics is leading the way in providing the theoretical framework of how to think about it and how to think about care work, time use, etc. Similarly, impoverishment of minority communities is also well suited to be studied from a heterodox economic starting point because it starts from structural discrimination. It centers structural power and therefore is a good starting point. However, heterodox economics is obviously not immune from Western centrism and lack of diversity. I can give you a few examples, but of course, these examples will be built on further by my fellow panelists. For example, when we think of unemployment in general, when we think of the problem of unemployment and inflation, we're necessarily thinking about the Phillips curve, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and that there is very little discussion of labor informality. And when we talk of, it's not that it's not there. Of course, it's there. The point is that we need to center it further, especially given that this is a key feature of developing economies and increasingly a key feature of developed economies. Furthermore, for example, let's come to a very hot topic, which is today, which is MMT. In MMT, the source of all inflation is overspending. And again, if you think of which again, that's a fairly good explanation in most circumstances. However, when we're considering structural factors and supply shocks and balance of payments constraints and countries where food inflation is a major factor that affects inflation, overspending does not explain inflation. And therefore, the lens of MMT, which is a heterodox approach, starts from looking at it as a demand problem, which is more likely in developed economies. I won't go into the last example, but my panelists will, my fellow panelists will go into this. Now, why is this important? The need for just decolonizing economics is important from a justice point of view in itself, because a discipline based on exclusion and homogeneity is unfair. But even if you don't buy that argument, even if that's not enough, it affects scientific quality. A discipline that's based on exclusion and homogeneity is unscientific, as it's missing key insights about the world it wants to study. Decolonizing economics does not mean that we only produce better knowledge about the global south, but also develop a richer understanding of several phenomena in the global north. And again, when we make these criticisms, it's important that I want to point out, to bring up a note of caution, that this is a structural problem. Therefore, typically in our experience, whenever we point out problems in the economics discipline, people individually get super defensive that, no, we don't do this, we're not like this. I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not trying to be discriminate against anybody. I have an open mind. And that's not what we're trying to say. The problem is structural, and therefore it requires a structural solution. It's a collective solution. So that's just my one note of caution as we go forward, and to keep in mind, because as I hope during the course of this panel, you will recognize that this is indeed a problem and it requires a solution. And the solution cannot come from us getting defensive about the problem and our role in it. It's a collective problem that we have to solve together. Anyway, I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Devika. So I'm next. Just share my screen, just 1 second. Here we go. Okay, is it okay? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so
you can talk louder.
Okay, sure. So is it fine? Okay, so thank you very much, everyone who is here today, and I would like also to thank you, all my co-authors in that panel, who has been a great source of knowledge, but also, a great fun to work together. So my job here today is to take us a step back and talk about whether or not economics has been colonized. Because if you've been talking about, okay, you need to decolonize the field, but it's also necessary then to question and to be sure if our field has actually been colonized. And of course, the answer for this panel, who is writing a book on decolonizing economics, is that the field has been colonized. And my job here is trying to convince this audience, why that is the case. And my presentation is basically about the origins of the discipline, how economics was born. And then from that, I hope to make a link with the Eurocentric nature of the discipline, and then make the case as to why we need to decolonize our field. Okay, so I will start with, well, the question I have already placed to all of us. Has economics been colonized? Our answer is yes. And the reason for that is because economics has a Eurocentric nature. So what that actually means, and I'm going to drop these entire slides here because this is in start unpacking things a little bit more. So as Devika made very clear, the field has been actually trying to deal with the issues of diversity and gender for a while. And for us, we have been trying to deal with both issues, the question of gender and race, also from the perspective of challenging the Eurocentric nature of the discipline. We've been doing that, as Ingrid mentioned, over 2 years ago, because although the CON was launched 2 years ago, we've been discussing that probably, I'd say, further than 4 or 5 years ago, when we're still first year PhD students, I reckon. So our perspective is, economics, as in any social theory, is immersed in a kind of in a pool of debates over methodology, over different narratives, different issues regarding structure and agency. And when you look into the history of these debates in social sciences, you can see these diverse ways to interpret and to understand the world, different perspectives we have. And what we think is very complicated here, if you see knowledge in this process of social constitution of knowledge, you can see that we have different objective realities within different cultures. We have different ways to express them. We have different methods to study them, and you have and you can't just look at these different ways to understand and to produce knowledge and think that that's just subjective or ideological. We have to try to deal with this diversity of views and methods. So because of this diversity of views and how we understand the world, we also have to consider here that who is telling that history, who is telling the history of human beings, the history of economics, the history of whatever, it matters who is the speakers of that history, because history can very well be a narrative of power, expressing the perspective of those who actually control the knowledge. So for us, when you look into this history, this historical process of the social constitution of the knowledge, we see that we have different forces making and shaping this knowledge. It's not just a linear process with one side telling that story. So that's our starting point for our discussion of whether or not economics is being colonized. We want scholars to understand that these elements regarding how knowledge is shaped, is constructed, how they work. And we need to be self-consciously that there are forces here shaping this knowledge, and you need to deal with them. So this for us is a question of, how in economics we then have to try to do that for our field. And for our field, this is particularly important. I know that economists, they always like to think they're the most important field, but in that case, it's true. Because when you look in the case of the beginning of the modernity, the Enlightenment period, we have this emergence of what we call the world economy. So we have the exchange among diverse societies, and we also have the West coming to rule at that time. And this has posed or has been interrelated with the challenge that this new knowledge producing at that time are facing. So many disciplines, including history, philosophy, international relations, they come to accept that they have to look at that period, they have to look at their own discipline and start questioning their thinking or their views of the world, and come to accept that their views has been formed by a kind of knowledge that was produced in a context with assumptions that justified colonial rules in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. To put it very simple, what we are trying to argue here, and we are following a much broader discussion regarding decolonization, is that during the age of the Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment, we have also these assumptions regarding a racial, a kind of hierarchy within civilization, and that has impacted and shaped the knowledge that is produced. And that takes us back to what Ingrid mentioned before, which is, other disciplines they have been asking that kind of question. They have been digging into that kind of a knowledge production. But economics for a very long time has remained very silent about this knowledge production, the dynamics of knowledge production. And that's what we are trying to get at when we are trying to understand if the field needs to be decolonized or not. And here, before I really get into that discussion, I want to just come with these slides, which is to give a little bit of taste, which Devika has already done as well, about how the Black Lives Matters and what happens in the US regarding the murder of the African-American George Floyd, how that has impacted the discipline. And that's very interesting because it really helps us to understand that there is a difference between diversity and what we are trying to do when it comes to decolonizing economics. And here I tried to make that difference in terms of questions. If before, for example, we are concerned with questions such as how does economic theory explain racial economic inequalities, no, sorry, I'm just missing the before. So if before you were concerned with questions such as what are the benefits of increasing racial and ethnic diversity in the field, or questions such as how can economics solve its problem, now we have a very different set of questions. For example, how does economic theory explain racial economic inequalities? Is colonialism a major explanation behind today's difference in economic inequality? How does economics understand the link between racial inequality and systemic racism? So this set of questions is very different than the kind of questions we were dealing before. So what that means, so if that's what's happening, if you're looking to the process of knowledge production within our field to trying to understand the field possible Eurocentric nature, what we start doing is to go back to the origins of our discipline, to trying to understand that. And this is very interesting because, again, to go back to the beginning of modernity, the Enlightenment point is during that period that we also see this advance of modern capitalism, the development of industry, the question of free trade, the globalization at that time. And that happens together with this massive increase in slave trade that then coincides is a nice word, with the British Empire. But what is very interesting here for us is that our field, when dealing with that, even if we, what's happened in that moment is we can possibly trace back to the Mesopotamian period and in many other different civilizations, some discussion regarding economics. But unfortunately, this is not really part of the traditional history of economic thought we usually taught. So we usually start talking about economics, or mention Adam Smith, who is the father of economics, looking at that period, right? So it's during that period that the science of economics is born, at the time known as a political economy. So, the development of economics as a discipline goes back to that period, at least traditionally how we are taught. And is a period where we associate economics with the mercantilist, with physiocracy. But, the question is associated with the rise of modern capitalism in Europe, which is very important. So, economics has this effective, this formal birth as a separate kind of discipline during that period. And of course, Adam Smith, with the publication of Wealth of Nations, is how we then see this author as the father of economics. So, of course, for us, we are looking to that, and we think this is problematic. I'll just separate here two reasons, but in the book we unpack in other reasons. The first one is, at the same time that is the case, that how our discipline was born, when you look at this historical evolution of our field, we see that gradually some important discussion regarding this historiographical discussion of capitalism was actually watered down. We don't teach that, and we don't teach issues around classes, imperialism, or slave trade, or colonialism. And De Vica has also mentioned that point as well. And the second implication of that kind of view of how economics was born is a certain kind of naturalization of capitalism, which also has consequence for our fields. In my next two slides, I'm going to discuss a little bit each of these problems, or that implication. So regarding this lack of historiography of capitalism in the field, and by that I don't mean about reading a book on history of capitalism. I mean about bringing that discussion within every single field of economics. So if you have that, what is happening is, we basically ignore that the history of capitalism and the process behind that actually, there's a vast literature debating how actually capitalism come into being. And in that debate, we have endless disputes and debates around, for example, the role of technological change, social classes, the state, the relationship between capitalism and imperialism, the question of capitalism and the nature of human behavior. We have all these discussions that this is completely detached from our life as economists at the research, but also at the teaching level. So we learned that history of economics that started with Adam Smith's views of the world. But the problem is, it should not be a surprise for us that this historiography of capitalism, you can at least separate here two very broad discussions. One is this kind of economic liberalism that we see with Adam Smith, for example, but there's also the other side, which we don't see much, which is the question of Marxism, for example. So within Adam Smith, we have this interpretation that capitalism is the most beneficial way to organize society, right? So we have this kind of, this kind of evolution in terms of how we trade, and then we reach capitalism, which is when, the nature for human behavior really flourish. However, in a Marxist view, for example, we are considering a little bit of the question of the historical reality that's specific of capitalism, and that means to consider contradiction between classes, the question of exploitation, and etc. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit more. So regarding the second problem, which is the naturalization, is that right? Yeah, the naturalization of capitalism. Here is also a little bit complicated, because what we see here, and that's linked to the first point, the first implication, is that we see in that kind of a description here, as economists, we don't even get to really unpack this. Even the naturalization of capitalism, we don't really look into it. You just assume that capitalism has always been there. And what that implies is that we have a human history that's nothing else than a history of removing all this obstacle for capitalism to kind of face its kind of full development. And so we have this natural and on a kind of inevitable progress, when history is basically this natural process of technological development, and economics then becomes associated with mainly markets and exchange. And markets here, it's like if they're captured from history, just as this question of a market economy, of progress, of trade, which is also very complicated for those familiar with Karl Polanyi. You can see the discussion of markets much more complex than that. So we have this history of this, the solid line between a continuity of non-capitalist societies and then capitalist society. And here, the region of capitalism is about trade, is about wealth, is about investment, is about accumulation of wealth. The nature of human beings associated with maximizing profit. There's this constant focus on improving the instruments of labor to enhance productivity, and that's how that's how our history, the history of economists, really is started. And then, of course, what I want to highlight here is that in this account, what is happening. Basically, the development of capitalism is also a Western European process and thought by Western thinkers. We don't see that there is this economic history, the economics and historical and political context in which the discipline developed. We don't question the connection between economics and the development of capitalism. And of course, if that is the case, we do have some problems. We have consequences of that, and that's when I'm getting to move then to this more Eurocentric, this aspect of the discipline. So in terms of the consequence, I'm sorry, this slide's a little bit crowded, but the first one is that the economics, in economics, basically the development of capitalism is this kind of period where we have this rationality, we have technological development, and the relationship between, of course, capitalism development and colonialism and slave trade, the structural racism, this is often ignored and neglected. They are not part of the discipline, right? They're not looking at. The second point is, and that's very interesting for those who has been in the field for a long time, this gets even stronger and stronger, is the question of the language of economics. Is a language that's neutral, that's objective, that conceals these power imbalances and structural inequalities. So we have this claim of objectivity, which goes back to Enlightenment and modernity. We have these economic laws that literally function for various social and political and historical contexts. So other voices, other interpretation, other views are excluded. So that's where we are. And then for us, obviously, it's not that we have a kind of a neglect regarding the history of capitalism, and then we also have, as a consequence, this kind of impact. There is something further when it comes to that naturalization of capitalism, which is something we also are heading to, and that is my next slide. So what is, what we want to highlight from these, like as two outcomes of this naturalization of capitalism are basically 2 points, and perhaps is a little bit repetitive, but I really want to make that very clear. So the first outcome is, scholarship on the legacy of colonialism, or, in the relation with industrialization, with distribution of wealth, is just not part of our discipline. If it is history, or if you're studying that, you have to find different journals, but not the top journals in economics, as the Vic explained already, to get published. So here, we definitely not dealing with the structural racism that comes from this colonial legacy. The other point is that this history of the development of economic ideas that started with Adam Smith, which is the father of economics, is the most beneficial way to organize human society. And we just ignore what has been written before Smith, but also we don't recognize the exploitative foundations of capitalism that are highlighted by authors such as David Naroji and Walter Hodnett, which most of our students will never heard about these two authors. So here's where we are. So for us, if that's what's happened to our field, if you're not really giving attention to history in our field, but not just history, but the historiography of capitalism, because our discipline was born in that context, we are missing out a lot of important discussions that can actually be fundamental for every single economist, from a microeconomist to someone dealing with econometrics. We have to be aware of these problems. And that's why we had to, our question that led us to write that book proposal and launch our initiative, do we need to decolonize economics? So we have the question of if Eurocentrism is something that we assume in our discipline. So yes, we have to kind of start dealing with the possibility of decolonizing the field. So what we are arguing here is that we have this Eurocentrism as a nature of our discipline. And to be more specific, we kind of narrow that to explain that this Eurocentrism actually stems from two main sources. One is that economic theory that are developed in Europe, and it took European conditions as a starting point. They are then universal theories. The other point is just scholarship that are, that belongs to these Western societies valued. So with scholars from the Global South, such as me and the other two in that panel, if you want to succeed professionally, you have to, come from the Global South. You have to kind of embrace the mainstream theories that ignore your local knowledge. In the case, for example, I'm Brazilian. I intellectually grew up in this kind of environment of dependency school, the structuralist school. But these are topics that you're definitely not going to get published in top journals in economics, depending on where you want, to find your place there. So you have to drop what you learn and kind of go toward this more universal kind of knowledge, this objective, neutral and knowledge that we have in economics. So just to kind of highlight what the Vicar had said, if you're not sure about this Eurocentrism, there is this paper, which I think the Vic was also mentioned, regarding, we have this globalization of the world, but have we had the globalization when it comes to academic publication? And the answer is not. This paper is looking to over 76,000 papers that were published from 1985 to 2004 in top 200 economic journals. And then here you can see research working on countries other than the US don't get a fair deal in top journals. The probability of publication in top 5 journals is much larger for papers looking at the US. And I mean, the paper is amazing. You should read, but that gives a little bit of a taste of what's happening. So to conclude, what can be done? So for us, there's just one single answer, really. We need to decolonize in economics. And I think my next colleagues are expand a little bit more on that, but I just want to give a little taste of what this decolonization really means. You know, what we're doing here, we want to have to break this hegemony of the West in a process of knowledge production, which also the Vic has mentioned. You know, we have to create academic space where theories that are non-Westerns, they also have their space. They also can be discussed. And of course, more specifically, we want to break away from this kind of idea of universality, objectivity, and neutrality. And in my view, if you're aiming for a more inclusive discipline, a discipline that provides analysis that neither remove the social or the historical context or see the economy as a separate entity that is, you know, separate from ethic and power and everything, we're really not going to be able to produce a knowledge in our field that can improve society. So how am I doing for time? Do I have 2 minutes left or not?
I think you're over time.
Okay, so that's it. So that's me for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carolina and Devika and Ingrid. So I'll just go straight to my presentation. Okay. Right. So I think Devika and Carolina have really kind of set the field from where I want to take off. And what I want to talk about is what gets lost in a Eurocentric understanding of economics and insights from a decolonized economics. What I'll do here is try to use a critical decolonial lens to understand certain insights of the economic theory, and then give a flavor of what are these alternate understandings and how do they question what we rather take as pre-given understandings in economic theory. So what does a decolonized version of economics look like? Does this imply having more voices from post-colonial economies, something that my co-authors have addressed in detail? Yes, but is it only about more voices from the post-colonial economies? No. What we're trying to do here is to assess the radical roots of this project itself, which goes beyond the issue of diversity and geographical positionality. What we are questioning is to move beyond taking these global North-centric understandings as the starting point, which is then basically questioning the looking of the entire world through the lens of the global North, wherein the global North or the West is the norm, whereas everything else is the other or the aberration from the norm, which is something that Carolina talked about in much detail. So thanks a lot. I'll just kind of use that to dive into my next point. So what do we mean by a global North-centric understanding? Is it merely a geographical location? No. Global North is a representation of the essence of capitalism and the representation that celebrates capitalism, which is precisely the reason why other non-mainstream strands which critique capitalism are also actively and structurally excluded even within the global North. And I don't think people in the URPE panel need to be convinced about it. So even, however, the problem gets magnified. Why? Because even within these non-mainstream strands, the critiques that emanate from the global South are not prevalent. So do we then just shift our focus from global North as the focus or the locus of our understandings to simply global South? No, because then we are attempting to create an alternate power hierarchy, and that's not what we are trying to do. What we are talking about is to move away from viewing global South as just an other, rather to place them in a similar plane of power, rather to dismantle power, to think about independent pluralities, to question the representation of a truth, which Carolina again talked about in much detail, in terms of a truth that is only specific to one theoretical understanding, and posit it as a universal truth with a capital T. We are moving away from a capitalist modernity as, the form of modernity, but rather exploring several different forms of modernities. What I'll do in my presentation is to talk about a specific example of development economics as a discipline, as a case in point, how it has evolved, and analyze it from a decolonial lens, and also talk about a few insights from the global South perspectives. And I'll just kind of use that lens to see how one can inform even our Marxian theory understanding and a particular example of labor and informality in this context. Why is the project of development economics important, and why didn't we choose to talk about any other subdiscipline? Because development economics as a project became a very important project in this entire landscape of decolonization. As the economies or the post-colonial economies gained their independence, this was a project which came into being in terms of their political sovereignty, where it wasn't just the economic theories of the West that was simply imposed on the economies of the global South. Rather, it was a sovereign project where it was understood that there's going to be a new way of understanding their own realities and developing. So it was in some sense supposed to be a sovereign project. It recognized the structural differences of the global South economies and talked about tailoring economic development for the quote unquote third world. However, even in doing so, it remains a little short and rather reproduces a West-centric vision of development. In fact, there's an active use of political power to shape this West-centric discourse. Now, just by kind of looking at this discipline, we'll see how in how the discourse itself gets shaped in a politically hierarchical world. Once colonialism ended, the paternal responsibility that the West had to develop the formal colonial economies did not really end. In fact, even with this inauguration of the new development age that happened with President Truman's inaugural address in his point where, and I have the quote there, which I won't go into, but in this entire project, two value-laden categories were produced, but were posited as value neutral in order to take it out from the sphere of political contestations. So development meant something and underdeveloped meant another particular thing, but it was almost seen as two hierarchically value neutral category where how underdevelopment was brought into fore for the global South economies with colonialism was written away, and what development meant was occluded and actively occluded. In fact, all the definition and representations of what was development was about this idea of Western conception and values as the benchmarks. Development was not politically uncontested. It was capitalist transformation, as Lewis's classic 1954 article, which then became the basis of much of the development discourse, laid out very clearly, where a less developed economy was characterized by an economic dualism with the coexistence of a large non-capitalist and traditional segment of the economy and a much smaller capitalist or modern segment of the economy. On the other hand, a developed economy was one that was homogeneously modern and therefore, or homogeneously modern or capitalist. And therefore, development was basically capitalist transformation, which was to be brought about by economic growth and capitalist accumulation. So again, it was the shaping of the global South along the image of the global North, particularly in terms of a capitalist transformation. And this entire process was almost assumed to be some sort of a techno-bureaucratic process, which required certain policy adjustments to realize economic growth. And voila, we have a transformed economic structure because Global South was apparently just a prehistory of what Global North was. In this entire understanding, the social and political complexities and contradictions that kind of underlay this entire process of how transformation or development was to be brought about was deemed as irrelevant. So Sen has this really interesting quote in his 83 article, which says, these countries have been expected to perform like wind-up toys and lumber through the various stages of development single-mindedly. And he quotes Hirschman to say, these countries were perceived to have only interests and no passions. And in this entire framework, one can understand how theories of critical minimum effort, big push, etc., while recognizing the structural differences of the global South economies, was still functioning under that framework. Nevertheless, like I said, these were theories that recognize the structural differences of the global South. However, 70s becomes a very important turning point where there's still, despite all these policies that are brought into existence, there's still widespread poverty, informality, and a continued persistence of non-capitalist spaces. So much so that these non-capitalist spaces weren't only in the rural and agriculture sector in the economy, but were rather emerging even in the industrial and urban spaces, which was supposed to be the seedbed of capitalism for these economies. So this was seen as if this was a failure of state intervention, rather than critiquing the project of development itself. And what really followed from this was basically the neoclassical revival of development economics, or the development economics, where there's a recentering of the theories of individuals and markets, and erases the entire structural specificity of Global South. And the focus of the entire development economics then becomes about correcting market imperfections, informational asymmetries, and our entire development, curriculums in most of the countries, in most of the universities, is what focuses on this. And interestingly, our cities in new institutional economics are two important examples that I just want to say here, because RCTs claims to be value free, and Ingrid has some very interesting critiques of RCTs that I would really recommend people to look up. But it's, despite claiming to be value free, it basically brings the focus back on individual and makes it as much a part of the neoclassical theory as anything else, where the individual needs to be nudged to push them on the path to prosperity. New institutional economics, supposedly a very progressive way of understanding economics, because it brings institutions back into economic understandings. So in that sense, it takes into account various critiques of neoclassical economics. However, in this entire new institutional economics, despite bringing history back into economics, what it does is views the institutions of the Global South as some things which need to be corrected in order for it to be able to be good enough, or rather to be corrected for promoting the process of capitalist accumulation. Now, there have been a long tradition of Global South-centric understandings which are actively excluded. This starts from the early dependency theories, starting from 67, 69, early 60s, in fact, where they argue that the underdevelopment and development is not two stages of development. Rather, both of these as a result of a common historical process. They characterize the entire world economic order in an extractive global capitalism. However, this, of course, then I'm not going to go into the details of it. I'd love to come back to it during discussions. But then, of course, there are these long traditions of mode of production debate that emanated from South Asia and Latin America, which are talking about, or rather, which then take off from dependency in order to place the in some sense, it actually expands the dependency itself in order to focus on the production sphere rather than simply on the exchange sphere, which some early dependency theories did. And but in a lot of the mode of production debates, the idea was that these alternate mode of productions are in fact transient. Sorry. But with higher capitalist accumulation, there would in fact be a full-fledged capitalist transition. I'm so sorry. Anyway, so going forward, and of course, there have been later developments of dependency and various other structuralist Marxists who have brought together the insights from early dependency in terms of dominance of the global north, as well as focusing on the particular production features of the global south economies in order to understand the lack of capitalist transition in these economies, or the lack of development. Now, these different strands provide various different reasons of why this transition has not successfully taken place in the developing economies. And a lot of these strands are not, most of these strands are in fact not taught to students across the world. The reasons that they talk about is lack of capitalist accumulation or dynamism, or there's imperialist relation, or capital needs these non-capitalist spaces to exist, either by providing the reserve army of labor or by providing cheap wage goods, etc. The other strand that kind of questions this entire development is basically questions the entire apparatus of development itself, where they say that whether capitalist development is even a desirable modernity that we are aspiring towards. And it links to what I started with earlier in terms of how this development and underdevelopment are born as two categories which are not in fact value neutral. An interesting strand that's emanated very recently from India is the works of Kalyan Sanyal, who is basically who kind of reposits the need to rethink the entire process of post-colonial capitalist development, where the argument is that the persistence of dualism or the persistence of non-capitalist spaces is not due to a lack of capitalist transition. Rather, the process of capitalist accumulation itself creates its non-capitalist outside. So in that terms, it's a departure where he argues that capital is always in a state of becoming, and therefore questions the possibility of a full-fledged capitalism, not empirically, but also theoretically. And through this process, he says a vast majority of the population that occupies these non-capitalist spaces is not a reserve army, is not something that's needed by the capital. It's in fact surplus for the process of capitalist accumulation. In some sense, he's also questioning this capitalocentric lens of development itself. And in this interesting work by other post-colonial scholars, Partha Chatterjee, others, they basically posit that post-70s, the entire issue of development becomes that of governance of the poor, with your World Bank loans coming in, your IMF loans coming in. It's basically to help subsist this surplus population in the economy in order to maintain political stability. All these strands, from dependency to the later dependency to mode of production to Sanyal, they provide an alternate vision of looking at development with global south, of global south in its own terms. It is not simply conceptualizing the global south as an image or an aberration from the global north. And this kind of non-capitalocentric version that Sanyal is talking about and some other scholars talk about is something that is a very valid critique even within Marxian theory. For example, in a lot of Marxian theory, mainstream as well as the non-main, the dominant Marxian theories, there's a shared capitalocentric vision of the world where capital is the center of the entire understanding. Whereas again, there are these various non-determinist Marxist understandings, which basically provide a framework which is more amenable to a decolonial lens of theory itself, who's talking about economy in terms of multiple fragments where capital is not at the center. And the earlier strands that I discussed, in fact, develop the understanding of global south in its own image and on its own terms. And it is this that we think provides a decolonial lens itself to understanding development. A very small example, just based on all the strands, the global South-centric strands that I've been discussing, is the issue of labor and informality. By 70s, what starts happening? Sorry, Ingrid, could you give me a time check, please?
You have about 3 minutes.
Okay, cool.
Oh, you muted yourself.
You're muted. You muted yourself.
Wow, great. Thanks a lot. Okay, so by 70s, what starts happening is just to recap, what I'm trying to do is the decolonial lens that we tried to develop in these last strands, or rather in these last slides, I'm going to try to use that to understand this issue of labor and informality that Devika already talked about in her initial slides. So by 70s, what has started happening is, while there's a transition out of agriculture sector, in the less developed economies, these traditional non-capitalist spaces are again being reproduced even within the cities, even within the industrial sector, which are supposed to be the seedbed of capitalism. So T.G. McGee in a 70s article calls them the peasants in the cities, because it's the peasant system of production reproduced within the cities. And interestingly, by 70s, ILO has these different missions, which in their report, they actually say that they've discovered the informal sector in the less developed economies. And there have been different ways in understanding this informal economy, both in the mainstream as well as non-mainstream perspectives. But a unifying thread that has remained is basically this expectation of withering away of the informal or the non-capitalist segments with growth. However, the decolonized lens that we're trying to develop is basically talking about that how this informality in non-capitalist segments have not simply continued to persist as vestiges of the past that would wither away with growth or capitalist accumulation, rather are reproduced with the process of capitalist growth and accumulation itself. So what you're saying is that capitalocentrism, or that idea of development, is not what is supreme, and it is that we are trying to question itself. And interestingly here, this question becomes even more profound today because informality is apparently the new normal in 2000s. And Guy Standing in his 2014 book calls it the new working class and the non-standard form of employment. First, it's not new. It's been the standard form of employment for the majority of the world. Second, even in terms of the newness in the global north is highly contested. Works of van der Linden and Bremen basically talk about that these standard employment relations were probably just an aberration during the Fordist era. And there have been, Tabak and Crislow and others have talked from taking the non-determinist Marxian lens to show that there has been a persistence of informal and non-capitalist production structures all through the US history. So how is it that just a capitalocentric lens becomes kind of the center of this entire project of development? And that, again, from what Carolina talked about, that how this can be linked to the development of capitalism itself. So flowing from, since those are our roots of capitalism or of Eurocentrism, we use that to then question this entire idea itself. And like I said earlier, we're using the entire strand, starting from dependency to MOP to post-colonial scholars now, to basically question this entire understanding. I'm on my last slide. I'll end it in a while. So why are these different ways of understanding our realities occluded? Because there has to be a hegemony given to a specific lens of viewing. If these other realities or study or understandings are placed at a similar plane of possibility, then how does one ensure supremacy of the one superior or promised form of capitalism? If informality is as much a part of capitalism as, let's say, a Fordist period of capitalism, then how is that a superior form or a promised form that within capitalism one could have? So are we asking about discarding of economic theory as we know? Well, no. But what we are talking about is that this decolonized lens to economic theory does not view these non-hegemonic understandings of the world as aberrations. They are one of the multiple possibilities that exist and pretty much as a part of capitalism. It is a critique of the issue of power, whereby capitalism of the first world kind, of the Fordist kind, is in fact normalized. So we're using this lens to question the possibility of capitalism not only in the global south, or rather to question capitalism or the forms of capitalism we've been made to accept not only in the global south, but also in the global north. For example, we are questioning if it is even possible to have a full-fledged capitalism and for the promise of capitalism to be fulfilled both in global south and in global north, particularly or rather not capitalism, this would all be under capitalism, but let's say a formalized capitalist relations or the promised form of capitalism. What we're trying to do here in the book, drawing from all these strands, is to bring a new theoretical lens to understand global capitalist development that is a post-colonial lens to global capitalism. So this is not a celebration of everything that's traditional or primitive or all understandings from the global south. This is a project of thinking of alternative modernities at a similar plane, which breaks away from a narrow conception of global north-centric capitalist modernity, which in fact breaks away from capitalism itself. This, in that sense, is a radical questioning of epistemic power and the violence it ensues. And why is this important? Because in our analysis of the object, which is the social world, the object is not immune to our touch. Rather, we are constantly creating these realities by our analysis of it in an overdetermined manner. Thank you. These are the key references. Happy to share the slides.
Thank you so much. We can put the slides up on the Decon website afterwards. So I put the address in the chat, so feel free to go there. Okay, so thank you very much for those excellent presentations. So mine is the final one, and I'll build on what Devika, Carolina, and Serbi have been saying to look a little bit at what we can do as academics or as students. Some of you may be students within our universities, within our teaching, within our learning. So I would then invite you all to think about how you can change your own practice. And also, while I'm talking, also feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, which we'll address once I'm done there. Oh, you can't see my screen, can you? Okay, I'll try again. There? Yeah, perfect, cool. Okay, so Decolonizing Academia and Pedagogy, a practical proposal. This is the final part of the book, and there's a lot of material here, so I won't be able to go into everything in detail, but it's a little bit like a teaser. And if there's specific things that you want to go more into, we can do that in the Q&A. So briefly, what I'll be talking about is what is the problem with the university, with pedagogy, with economics teaching? How can we address these problems? How can we decolonize the university? How can we decolonize teaching and pedagogy? And then finally, a little bit about like decolonizing society, because ultimately decolonization isn't just about, you know, obscure theory. It's actually about real material imbalances in power that come from colonial legacies. And in order to address this, we need better economic teaching and learning and research. But ultimately, the goal is changing society. So I'll address that a little bit at the end, in addition to what this means for heterodox economics. We haven't really distinguished that much between different kinds of economics yet, but we can do that in the Q&A as well. So what is the problem? So in terms of decolonizing the university, a really good place to start is this edited volume by Gurminder Bambra and her colleagues. And because while it's often assumed that universities are this space of critical thinking and radical free thinking academics, actually there is a lot of evidence to show that in many ways universities stifle creative thinking, especially heterodox economists will be very familiar with this. They often reproduce dominant frameworks and colonial and patriarchal oppressions. And universities were central for colonial intellectuals as spaces to develop theories of racism and to bolster support for colonial endeavors. So there is a colonial legacy to universities as well. And the fall of formal empires did little to change the logic of Western universities. So even after the fall of old forms of colonial oppressions, advancements of the specific kinds of knowledge and discourse that valorizes the experience of the West has been used as a powerful tool by imperial powers to exert their influence over the rest of the world. So this is a key issue to address if we want to decolonize economics and decolonize the university more generally. So why decolonize pedagogy? So in line with what has been said already with economics, Eurocentric and universalist character that Serbi and Carolina talked about a lot, the subject is generally taught as a field that contains a bunch of fixed, objective, and neutral principles. So if I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Principles of Economics books, the textbooks that I just put there. It's a field that's often taught through textbooks, focusing on technical knowledge rather than critical and exploratory thinking. And it's very often taught in this way that's abstracted from history of thought and economic history and the political nature of the field. So a lot of economic students will never know that there's these massive political debates about economic theory because they just get presented with these principles, right? And of course, as Serbia went into in some detail, the non-Western scholarship that she mentioned is largely neglected in economics curricula across the world. And then in addition to this like content of economics, there's also this instrumentalist pedagogy that's prevalent in economics. And so instrumentalist education is basically when students are trained in these concrete identifiable skills, like problem solving or specific techniques or application of theory, which is in contrast to liberal education, for example, or critical pedagogy, which some of you might know from Paulo Freire's work, or bell hooks, or decolonial pedagogy. So it's also about the way that economics is taught, the way that economic students are geared towards certain kinds of assessments, etc. It's not just the content. So these two go together. So we did a survey last year on economics, how economists teach economics. And we looked at economists in the mainstream departments, economists in heterodox and pluralist departments, and economists in interdisciplinary departments, development studies departments, politics departments. And one question was whether economists teach about racialized inequalities or the role of European colonialism in their courses. And here are the results. So you see that there is quite a big difference here in between the mainstream and the heterodox, pluralist, and others. And the mainstream is quite not very likely to teach about racialized inequalities or European colonialism. So as Devika said earlier, heterodox economics or other departments might be like a better starting point for starting to understand decolonization and colonization and these power imbalances. But of course, there's problems there too. But this, we thought these results were quite interesting, and you can find this. So Serbia and I wrote about this on the INET blog. So that's where this graph is from. And here is a graph in a paper that's forthcoming, where we looked at how, so these are questions about whether economists think that we need to move away from textbook teaching, if we need to stop thinking like an economist, which is often because especially in the mainstream, economists are taught to think like an economist, right? And that's usually neoclassical economics. And then the other question was, do you have difficulty in relating the standard economics curriculum to the context in which you're teaching? So you can see here again, it's the mainstream economics departments are the light green. So they're the ones that are the happiest with the way the field is, the least dissatisfied, the least willing to or likely to see that there should be a change in the field. But at the same time, you see that the heterodox economists and the others are not as critical as you might expect regarding these things. So that was also interesting to see. Now, so that's the problem in a nutshell. Now, how to decolonize? This is a massive debate, of course. So just very quickly, and in the book, we're going to go into this in much more detail. But there are very many things that you could do in terms of the university. And there, with each policy proposal that we can discuss, there's always like a kind of liberal way of doing it, a radical way of doing it, and very many pitfalls. And of course, each policy would need to be tailored to the specific problems within that department or field or institute. So here are just some examples. And so for example, promoting more inclusive recruitment and promotion practices, that's really important. So in order to do this, the reform would need to start from observing how and why hiring and promotion practices may be implicitly racist or sexist or elitist or Eurocentric to begin with. And once we've mapped that, then we need to assess how we can change that structurally, right? So it's not just about keeping the structures the same and then just trying to, add some more people of color or women, but we really need to think about why are these sexist and racist? Why are these institutions racist and sexist to begin with? So this would involve, for example, breaking away from this narrow definition of excellence, for example, as defined by the top 5. That would be like highly relevant in a mainstream department, for example. It involves recognizing and rewarding publications in a broader set of outlets. So that would include non-Anglophone journals, for example, or non-Western journals, as Devika mentioned in her presentation. They're often not recognized for promotion purposes. And it's important also to recognize that even seemingly neutral policies often have negative impacts on women and minorities. Like, for example, in a lot of the top economics departments, they eliminate candidates who take more than 6 years to complete their PhD. So this often has a negative impact on women in particular. So that's just one example of how to think about, one policy. That, each policy really needs unpacking. So other things to do, initiatives aiming to create a more inclusive environment, challenge the neoliberal university that we can also talk a lot more about. And an important point is that it's not just about decolonizing and changing the things that we do in the global north, but also work to support and strengthen non-Western institutions and institutions in the global south in particular that are highlighting and promoting non-Western ways of thinking, decolonial approaches, right? And of course, reforming journals and associations, promoting more inclusive practices there. And also, we have a lot of work to do in terms of providing more open access material, both for students and for the public in general. So that was very briefly about the university. And now pedagogy. So there's a lot of potential in terms of decolonizing pedagogy. At the one hand, you have bell hooks who says the classroom is the most radical space for possibility. But at the same time, you have a lot of scholars, including ASSA and de Jong, who wrote a book about decolonizing teaching, where they see the classroom as possibly being a space of marginalization and alienation, especially for underrepresented groups. So the classroom is a space where, there's a lot of work to do, and it has the potential to be a radical space, but it's not necessarily the case, right? And this relationship between pedagogy and coloniality is something that's been deeply understudied, as Barbara and her colleagues write in this Decolonizing the University book. So we've been developing lots of principles that are in many ways questions to ask yourself when you're thinking of how to decolonize your own teaching. And so it's not easy to create a checklist, right? Because it'll be different in different contexts. But one example is place text in context. And I think that's Carolina's presentation demonstrated how that's very relevant. So basically that means making explicit the relationship between the text or the concept that you're teaching your students and the context in which it was written. So not allowing like the so-called founding fathers to retain this privileged place of neutrality, to recognize that all knowledge comes from somewhere. That everyone has a standpoint, right, from which they see the world. And that needs to be communicated to students that are reading these scholars. And from a decolonial perspective, pedagogy needs to involve this kind of positionality. And there's a lot of other principles that I could go into, but I don't want to just list, lots of principles. I'd rather have a discussion about them, but some of them are linked to the specific context and time in which the students find themselves, so that what they learn is relevant and helps them understand the context in which they live. Decenter the Western canon, of course, improve representation in reading lists, challenge universalism, Eurocentrism, address decoloniality, teach the role of empire and colonialism in shaping economic outcomes, address unequal power relations, recognize the implicatedness of ourselves as basically our own positionality and privilege, and also employ critical pedagogies and diverse ways of knowing. So not just, essay, exam, a kind of approach to pedagogy, which there's also a lot more to say about. So now, decolonizing society, which is a much broader and more difficult question in many ways. I think it basically boils down to asking ourselves how the structures in which we find ourselves reinforce colonial patterns of domination, including imperialism and racism. So this links back to Devika's presentation, basically, about how it's not just about diversity, right? It's really about challenging the structures that limit diversity, which come from racism, which come from imperialism and sexism and other forms of discrimination. And in the book, where we've highlighted lots of different policies and how you can address policies that seemingly maybe don't seem colonial, like international finance or evidence-based policymaking or health policy or educational policy or climate change. But that you can, once you unpack it, you can actually see that there are a lot of colonial legacies that are important to unpack and address when developing policies in these areas. So in terms of climate change, just one example, applying these principles or this question, we can then ask what anti-colonial and anti-racist climate change policy would look like, or climate policy. So that means recognizing that colonialism was in many ways an environmental project, and that the environmental policies remain colonial in many ways. So to decolonize climate policies then would mean to address how colonialism left legacies of extraction, vulnerabilities that post-colonial countries now have to cope with. And there's massive movements in the global south and in the global north that are trying to address this through calling for reparations, for example, from the polluters and the colonizers based on the concepts like climate debt and ecological debt. So that is, stands very much in contrast to the mainstream radical views on climate change that, the Green New Deal or degrowth, where they often don't consider these colonial legacies, although, they can, and it's very important that they do. So that's just one example of how to think about decolonizing policies. In terms of decolonizing society, it's that as a member of society, if we want to, take part in this decolonization agenda, the first step is to recognize our own positionality and explore that, our own privilege, and how that impacts the way that we act, and maybe we maintain structures in a certain way. How can we challenge that? Educate ourselves, seek to understand how institutions in our communities may be reinforcing colonial and racist policies, and organize around a decolonization agenda. So finally, what does this mean for heterodox economics? Because often, heterodox economists think that they're exempt from this critique because we're already, critical and radical, and already marginalized. But there are a lot of these colonial legacies that are present in heterodox institutions as well. So thanks to heterodox economists can work on decolonizing of course, the curriculum. Non-Western thought is to a large extent excluded in heterodox curricula as well. Pedagogical reform as well, and institutional changes to editorial boards, journals, and associations. And of course, in the end, we're all a part of this like university structures, right? And it's important to also challenge those. I have some key references, and it's not really fair to give them to you like this because you can't read them that quickly, but here they are, and we'll put them on the website, as I mentioned. And finally, decon, little slide on decon. So please join if you find this to be interesting. We are a network of students and faculty and policymakers across the world that are, spread across different working groups. So you can find out more on our website and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you. So stop sharing. So now we have about half an hour left for discussion. And I saw the Q&A box blowing up a little bit while I was talking, which is great. So that means that there's a lot of questions. And so I think I'll ask my fellow panelists if there's any one of you that would like to start addressing some of these questions, if you've been looking at them while I was presenting.
Should we just go in the order in which we spoke?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. In that case, there's a few questions. There's two questions, I think, that I can directly address. One is from, and again, like if I address them, if somebody else would like to say something more, feel free to like jump in. And also to the audience, feel free to challenge us on anything that we have said. I know there's like a lot of claims that we will explore more in the book, but yeah, feel free to challenge us on anything that we have said, and we can explain further. Anyway, from the question from Elia Castiblanco, they say, it seems to me that some journals think that decolonizing is to encourage empirical works from non or underdeveloped countries. But if they come from scholars in these countries, these papers are not welcome. Do you think this is a correct hypothesis? Thanks so much for the question. I'm honestly, if journals are actually thinking about decolonizing economics, I think it's actually a big step forward. I don't think I've ever heard of from any journal editor, or that they've actively been thinking about like how to do this. In general, what they have been thinking about is how to get more submissions. And I think this has been, at least with my experience for heterodox journals, that how do we solicit more, and how do we provide support to people who are submitting from developing economies? Not that they need support, but there's a lot of like structural factors that prevent the publication. For instance, sometimes there's a huge language barrier for which these journals don't give adequate support for, and that's one of the things that we want to address as well. So I'm not sure this is the correct hypothesis. I think this would be a start. Let's assume that this is a correct hypothesis, that this is what journal editors want to do. I think that's a good starting point, because starting the conversation is important, but it's nowhere near what needs to be done. For instance, I don't think we should only be limiting decolonization to just empirical papers. It should be all kinds of papers from all kinds of contexts, and which also means that we broaden our understanding of what counts as a good economics paper. Does it have to be like some obscure proprietary data set that nobody has access to, that gives you a really like cool obscure result that you can then publish in a top 5 journal? Or could it be a far more descriptive historical analysis in addition to a robust econometric analysis? We need to challenge. And what if like it doesn't have any econometrics? Is this then not economics? Or it has like no theoretical formal mathematical model? Is it then not economics? Like, we need to challenge these things. In addition, as I mentioned, there needs to be a recognition of the language barrier, and therefore the support needs to come from the journal. Otherwise, the people who are submitting, they're internalizing the costs, and often they can't internalize the costs. And it's not only a cost in a monetary cost, often it's a cost in access. Do you have, if as a scholar based in a developing economy, do I have access to the networks that can make publication more likely? So these are the things that are important. It's not like, again, I'm not sure if I accidentally suggested that papers coming from scholars based in developing economies are not as good. I absolutely did not. That was not my intention, and I hope I did not suggest that at all. But yeah, so it's not just that you need more papers, but also the subject matter, the language support, and far more needs to be done in order to actually decolonize the content of journals. Does anybody else want to add anything? No? Okay. That one's done, and I'm just going to do one more, and then we'll go back to, because this one is directly addressed to me. This is from Mona Ali, who wanted me to clarify my criticisms of MMT. Is the problem that MMT focuses only on demand? Wasn't sure what you meant. So I'm not very critical of MMT, actually. This was merely an example of I recently finished reading The Deficit Myth, which is, I think, which is a great foundational text of modern monetary theory. I highly recommend everyone to read the book. It's really interesting and insightful. What was striking to me was Stephanie Kelton described, in her book, as a key tenet of MMT, that a higher deficit is not an indication of overspending. Inflation is an indication of overspending, and therefore, if inflation is a result of overspending, and that is the indicator of inflation is the indicator of overspending. That was one of the key hypotheses of that Kelton presented, which was very convincing in a lot of settings. But at the same time, when I think about the present context of the pandemic, several countries in the developing countries are struggling. Central banks are struggling about how to manage inflation or inflationary pressures, even though we're in a generalized, like, depressed economy in basically all over the world. And therefore, the problem is not overspending. In fact, the problem right now everywhere around the world is underspending. But at the same time, we also have inflationary pressures. And therefore, I'm not saying that MMT cannot rise to the challenge, or other texts of MMTs haven't risen to the challenge of addressing this problem. But the key hypothesis about inflation is that it's an indicator of overspending. I don't think it applies uncritically to developing economies, and that's what I was meaning by that was what I meant with in terms of the comment I made about inflation and enmity. I hope that clarifies it. If not, please feel free to ask a follow-up. Anyway. Carol, you want to go next? You're on mute.
Unmute. Yeah, just unmute. Very sorry. There are a few questions that I typed the answer there. I think there's a question from Caroline or Carolina regarding, there are two questions that open up in 2 points. One is regarding the, are any of the authors, it's moving, sorry. Oh, here you go. Are any of the authors considering Black and racialized minorities inside the global North who remain excluded and attacked by capital-centric ways in development? I think the idea of the division between global North and South, as I think as Serbi who mentioned, is not really a geographic distinction. We have to be very clear about that. And in that sense, I think within the global North, I think someone for example, in the chat mentioned the case of Italy also being in the need to be decolonized. So I think the question here is, if you look probably in the global North and in the US, especially when it comes to Black scholars, you still can see both not only a marginalization of these scholars within the global North, but also if these global scholars, we know in economics, there's also have been studies on that unfortunately the burden of studying race and racism is on Black scholars. And if they are studying race, there are also studies showing that top journals are not publishing issues on race. So by default, they would be excluded from the debate, even if they are within the US and also in top universities. I think, I like to highlight Rhonda Sharp, who's doing a fantastic work with the review of Black political economy. And she always likes to start her talk saying, we are tired of this talk about race and racism and decolonization, because we're talking about that since the 1960s and nothing has changed. And she's based in the US, and I recommend to follow her work and follow. We can forward. She is actually part of the Decon, the advisory board of the Decon, and we invite her to speak quite a few times. And it's amazing because she knows this knowledge. She has such knowledge about the history of Black scholars within the US, trying to get their voice out there. So so I would really not see this global North and South divide as a geographic point. Regarding Marxism, I think probably the other three panelists may step in that as well. There is a broader question within Marxism, maybe two broader questions regarding the Eurocentric nature of Marx in Marxist theory, but also the question of if there is a hierarchy when looking to issues of gender and race, if that actually comes after we consider the issues of the conflict between capital and labor. And that's a massive discussion with different views, is a heated discussion. I think Marxism and Marxism theory has actually addressed the question of race and racism more than other theories within economics. But there's a different issue. But regarding how then, when it comes to dependency theory, if dependency theory has limits, if I understood your questions, because dependency theory is relying on there has a lot of influence from Marxism theory. I would say the limit of dependency theory is not so much the question of race or identities or identity politics, but it's more the question of how dependency theory and many Marxists as well follow this more linear view of history, this progress of history, where this, we are heading to capitalism in many ways about exchanging trade and lifting these obstacles. In the case of developing countries, that they are not, in the same position, then developed economies should remove these obstacles. So it's still a very linear progression. I know probably Ingrid is going to step in regarding that, but it's one of the limits that can be seen in independence theory when it comes to address this question of the Eurocentric nature of the discipline, because despite him being born in Latin America, for example, and have all these particularities of the economic development that's typical of Latin America, is still following this conception of capitalism, which is influenced by the West. And so this is still open to a debate. I'm sure people would disagree. Yeah, I will stop here. I could take another two, but I'll stop here to see if the other panelists will say, and then I come back.
Thanks, Devika and Carolina. So I'll just take a few questions. One, there's a specific, let me actually start backwards. So let me actually build up a little bit on what Carolina already mentioned in terms of Marxism, broadly speaking. I guess we all kind of agree that heterodox provides a better view, or these alternate strands provide a better framework that's more amenable to talk about issues of race, identity, etc., because power is a central feature of all of the strands that we're discussing, particularly Marxian theory that we are discussing. But of course, there are various ways in which it falls short, particularly to take decolonial lens if we are talking about a deterministic traditional Marxian theory. And what Carolina pointed out very clearly, that dependency challenges that in a big way by questioning that linear historiography or a stagist argument of development. And similarly, what I also try to mention in my presentation in terms of the non-determinist Marxist framework, which are not capitalocentric, which are not keeping capital at the center of their entire understandings, where you can have where class is defined as a process of production, appropriation, distribution, which could happen even in patriarchal relations. Who owns the surplus of any sort of relation is basically determines whether a process is capitalist, non-capitalist, etc. So be it these frameworks, be it dependency frameworks, they are in fact pushing the entire early traditional Marxian understandings a lot forward. So in that sense, they're critiquing, but also developing the Marxian framework. And that, I think, is kind of an interesting takeaway. Just kind of similar to that, there's a question on informal economy, which I'll take, which is basically, we're talking about policies of how the issue of informal economy can be solved, but I'll try to link it with the question on Marxism. How a lot of traditional Marxian theory still sees informal economy as a reserve army of labor. I'm sorry, but economies which have 93% informal and 10% or lesser formal sectors, you do not need a 90% informal economy to just be a reserve army for the 10%. A lot of this population is in fact surplus for the process of capitalist production, and there are other works and which I'll be happy to give references to in order to talk a little more about it. Of course, there are various strands that exist which basically talk about that the problem of formalization is not simply about legalizing these firms, it's about making these firms grow so that they can be more accumulation driven, so that they can hire more workers, so that they can come under this ambit of capitalist mode of production. So what a lot of traditional theorists, I'm not just talking about non-mainstream, but even mainstream, would talk about helping these firms grow, having more government expenditure so that these people are directly being absorbed into government-funded programs, etc. But what we're also trying to argue is, from a decolonial lens, is also something distinct. That one, there are possibilities when these people are in fact not absorbed as a part of that formal sector. In fact, in the global north, where this problem is quote unquote solved, we are seeing again a rising on informality and precarity, what Devika talked about. So capitalism in that sense, how much is a solution itself, we are kind of trying to question. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there and I can come back later. Thank you. And there were a few comments about multiple equilibria from Professor Fennell. So thanks a lot for that. Yes, we agree. Thank you.
Thank you. And oh my God, there's so many questions. This is amazing. I'm very glad that this is stimulating a lot of thinking and debate. So I think I'll address a few of them. I won't be able to address all of them, but we can keep coming back until time is up. I just wanted to add to the Emilia Castiblanco's question that Devika was talking about. because I think it's really important and interesting. And there was a similar question that just came in about journals as well. And this is something that I guess a lot of us are very concerned with. How do we decolonize journal practices, journal publishing practices? And I think that in a way, I think Emilia does have a point that a lot of the time, especially like the mainstream development economics journals, are saying that, oh, we're kind of decolonizing, or we're being more inclusive because we're including more work from developing countries, even though there's like very limited work on developing countries, as Carolina and Devika were showing, or as Devika showed. So there's an interesting article by Naritomi and some colleagues in World Development from last year, where they argue that randomized control trials, bringing them into development economics, is making it more inclusive, making development economics more inclusive, which brings in a kind of third point, because Emilia was pointing to people from developing countries and then scholarship on developing countries, but then there's also the issue of like non-Western approaches to development or to economics, right? And I think this is like a massive problem in development economics generally, that we think, oh, we just include more scholarship on developing countries and by scholars in developing countries, but they have to do it in the approach that we have set, that we have developed in the global north, that are tied to and often co-authored with scholars at the Poverty Lab at MIT. So that's a very kind of colonial way of including scholarship on the Global South and scholars from the Global South, that we also have to keep in mind when we're thinking about how to improve these journals. It's not just about getting more scholars from the Global South, it's about getting more diverse scholarship as well. And then what to do? There were a couple of questions about that, which is really hard. And of course, I mean, a part of it is, and this is risky for some journals, to start, accepting scholarship that isn't a part of the dominant paradigm. So there are some things I know journals are already doing, like I know Third World Quarterly at least has like workshops around in the Global South to support scholars from the Global South. And of course, they're a critical journal, so they're already then also supporting critical scholarship, which is important. We don't want to just, support scholars in the Global South to be a part of the dominant paradigm, which is what the RCT, the randomistas, basically do. They have, and this is what they say, that they're being so inclusive because they're having workshops all over the world to teach, people in the Global South to do randomized control trials. But this is an ongoing discussion that we need to have more. And then I just want a very short note on dependency theory, since I know Carolina and Serbi already give very good answers, but I just wanted to mention that I do think that it's true that it is a weakness of a lot of the dependency scholarship, that it doesn't address these other inequalities, but some of dependency theory does. And there is some, so Cristobal Kay's book from 1989, like the classic book on Latin American theories, the third chapter there is all about how race is incorporated, like the theories that do incorporate race and look at sort of internal dependencies in different Latin American countries. So there is some possibilities to include race, and there are some scholarship does it, but I think it's within the kind of mainstream of dependency theory. It's not something that a lot of scholars do, but definitely something to address if that's, a scholarship that we want to take forward and preserve, but improve. And then Catherine Scott has done some work on sexism within dependency theory, and I know she has a paper forthcoming where she tries to look at Samira Min's theories in a kind of constructive way to see how you could take a feminist lens on dependency theory, basically. So I think these are kind of emerging areas of research that are really important. And finally, can I take two more? I'll take two very short ones. So Karina Dengler, thank you very much for your question. And I think it's really important, and I hope that I didn't kind of suggest that including history of economic thought will necessarily mean decolonization of the curriculum, because I don't think it necessarily will, because we also need to decolonize history of economic thought, because often it's Smith, Ricardo, Marx, right? Keynes. And Smith is the father of economics, even though key insights from Smith were made by Chinese scholars before him, and Ibn Khaldun is the famous one who talked about the division of labor in the 1300s, way before Smith. But they, non-Western scholars just don't get the credit in history of thought courses. So this is something that we definitely need to work on as well. And then finally, on the pedagogy question on what about if you're on tenure track, you don't have time to focus on teaching? This is a really important question. And in the survey that we did last year, it came up as like, what is the major issue, like the major barrier for you to like decolonize or reform your teaching? And for a lot of scholars, especially in heterodox institutions, it was like time, resources. So that's a part of the whole, that's why we need to think of this in the context of the neoliberal university as well, and the pressures that are put on academics, which make decolonizing, reforming teaching like the last priority on an academic's list of things to do. So I'll stop there. And then I guess we can take like 2-3 minutes closing each, and then we'll be out of time. Do you have anything more you want to say, Devika?
Yeah, very quickly, there's a few unanswered questions, but like, yeah, maybe we just go around and make sure they're answered by the time we finish our remarks. Okay, so this one, okay. Oh, this is a comment, which I guess since it's agreeing with me, I might as well just say it out loud. Thomas Masterson was saying that I let everyone off a little too easily. I think people, I know people get defensive or into denial when confronted with their own complicity, but institutions only remain colonized with our compliance. How not to comply productively is the question. Once you realize and accept you have been complicit. It is true, and in some sense that just because we are talking about decolonization, it's like doesn't even make us exempt from all these challenges. And literally, when we're confronted with a lot of our own challenges to our project, we take it extremely seriously. So I agree, and I encourage everyone to think in the way that Thomas is encouraging us to think, that yes, it's the idea is not to be defensive, but to accept our responsibility and go forward in a productive manner. I think Shreyasi also asked a question about journals. I think this is a really good suggestion about word count, and to include references is increasingly limiting. And this is something we can obviously think about. And again, when we say think about, I just want to point out that as Decon, we're developing a whole host of resources. Unfortunately, 2020 has also slowed us down, and we were prepared to launch a database of underrepresented scholars. That slowed us down. We want to start a bulletin of research of research that is coming from journals not published in the US, UK, Europe, Western Europe. But yeah, that's still in the works because this pandemic has really hit us hard in terms of our own time. And in terms of, so yeah, a lot of these suggestions that you're giving us, we're gonna incorporate that. So please feel free to get in touch if you have more suggestions. And I'm just gonna, and Marcella is upset with us because we are only talking about English-speaking universities and schools, which, and I think that is also a very important challenge. And that's something that we've also been struggling with a lot. We have a language working group, and one of the major questions is how do we actually include? How do we make sure that scholarship that is not produced in English is in fact included? Is it merely a translation issue? I don't think so, that it's not only just a translation issue, because it's definitely most of the dominant research and the dominant paradigm and top research is conducted in English, but that's clearly a power issue, not merely an issue of translation. So yeah, if you have any suggestions about how to address this going forward, please feel free to join us. We don't have all the answers and we're working on it. So yeah, I'm just gonna stop here and give my other panelists a chance to weigh in. I've really enjoyed this panel and your questions, and please feel free to keep them coming. This is a project this book is a work in progress. This project is a work in progress. So yeah, all feedback, positive, negative, is very welcome. We take all feedback extremely seriously. So yeah, thank you so much.
And as a reminder, we have 8 minutes left in the program.
Thank you. And thank you, Devika. I'm just going to go through a few questions I've seen here very quickly, just to make sure we don't dismiss them, as Devika said. There's a question here about positionality. And by coincidence, I've been discussing that with Ingrid recently, so perhaps Ingrid also wants to add something, but I would like to to highlight that as economists, right, we are trained to be neutral, as we're trying to highlight in that panel, to be objective and so on. And I as a researcher, as an economist, I always try to, for a very long time, what I'm trying to do is to detach myself for every single thing that could be taken as objective, from my personal journey within economics, from my background and etc. It's just really recently when I start having more contact with different theories and also finding more familiarity and connection with some theories that obviously was close to my reality, is when I start questioning the question or incorporating the question of positionality. And I think it seems in that book we are heading to make clear that that's important as we move away from the question of neutrality, objectivity, and we're dealing with this diverse, with a range of different interpretations within different cultures, as I said before. We'll have to discuss the methodology of dealing with that. And I think positionality and position theory is something you're going to have to head and start discussing more, which is something, as Ingrid mentioned to me recently and highlighted, is something that feminist theory and post-colonial theory, they do more often than as economists. So yeah, so this is an important question, but we don't do that in the work, research, or even in a pub. At least I'm very special because I have this lot. When I go to the pub, I go to the pub with this lot, so it's easy, but it's not normal. And another question I would like to take here is the question that has been, I haven't been following much the discussion of Agnes Guzenbein on Twitter regarding, that's the Shalaja Fennell question here, regarding the authorship and how we include global South scholars in our syllabus, I guess, in our reading list. And I see here, this is the same effort we have to do when it comes to women in economics as well, to have a conscious, and noise is more tiring, is more workforce, but to have the concern of not only cite and quote authors from global scholars or from global South, but also read them. I think we had a discussion within Deco on a paper looking to Thailand, the religion in Thailand, something economics and religion in Thailand, and it had no Thai author in that bibliography, and that was published in a top journal of economics. So I think it's something we need to address, and I think it's part of this inclusion. But again, the observation is regarding how we do that inclusion, right? For example, in Latin America, we have a lot of economists that in the past have been trained in Chicago school, and now they still go to the US, more mainstream departments doing their education, and they come back to Brazil, to Latin America, and then they're going to implement this kind of policies again, not really following, considering the particularities of Latin America itself. So I have to be, I just think, I'm sure Shalai is not going towards that way, but that's an observation I want to make. And that's it. And yeah, it was amazing to be in that panel. And thank you.
All right, thanks. I'll just take a quick 2 minutes to answer a few questions. First, in terms of why aren't we talking about different European schools of thought itself? Like we said, it's not simply about strands that developed from Global South. We've rather, in fact, a lot of strands that we've been using are from Global North itself, but have a non-Eurocentric lens. And that is even the MR school that developed in the US, the Rethinking Marxism, Monthly Review, etc. And a lot of dependency does emanate from an initial understandings from the MR school as well. So we're not discarding that at all. Rather, we are recentering those and saying that they as well can have a decolonial lens. It's not simply about positionalities, but of course, we're talking much more about the Global South strands as well, because there are obvious reasons why a lot more would emanate from there, which is a decolonized version of it. In terms of Professor Caroline Hussain talked about, yes, the Miami Institute. Thanks a lot. I think they've been in touch with Devika and I in terms of that. So we're, as Decon, we're very excited to be engaging with them as well. In terms of, I guess just one last point that I want to end with, which is that this issue of diversifying and being in various kinds of journals, while it's important to raise the voices, and we're all committed towards ensuring that space as much possible, but what we're also calling for a radical questioning of the roots of economic itself, and a radical questioning of why these top universities have to be the only place, or these top journals to be the only place which we seek. It is basically the other can be created, or the hegemony can be created only if there's an other following that hegemony. We're also questioning why one should be the other while the other the hegemony. So thanks. And it was great to be on the panel, and I'm super excited for this project. Thanks.
Thank you. 2 minutes left. So I just think I'll just, the main one that is still unanswered is the interdisciplinarity one. So I'll go for that one. And then there's just, seems like there's a lot of thanks, which is great. Thank you for the thanks, people in the Q&A box. So yes, does Decon also look beyond interdisciplinarity? And then the question is about methods. So first part of that question, I mean, yes, of course, I think interdisciplinarity itself is not sufficient in any way to decolonize. And also, I mean, like economy, and this is also something that we saw in the survey, that a lot of economists in the mainstream think that by collaborating with political scientists or sociologists, that they're somehow radical or something. But of course, in political science and in sociology, there's also rational choice theory and, you know, very Eurocentric views of the world. So interdisciplinarity is not, the way that we see interdisciplinarity is not about just adding things onto like a mainstream economics, but actually looking at a social phenomena from, you know, in an open way and using tools and theories from different disciplines in that way. And that includes methodology as well. And we didn't talk about this yet, but we do have a part in the book where we talk about how economic methods can also be colonial. I recommend this book, White Logic, White Methods, which is about statistics. Also decolonizing methodologies. So this is definitely something that we're very concerned with. And I do think that a lot of economic questions, as you said in your question, are better answered by economists or scholars in other departments and other disciplines. And then I think there's like 20 seconds. And then I just, with that one, I just wanted to, with that time, I just want to agree with what Carol said about positionality. Because it was something that I had to answer. Someone was asking me about, why are you interested in global inequality, and then what about your upbringing is it that like led you to this path? And I had to like, and I felt very awkward writing about my background, because, you know, as economists, we're not trained to do that. Feminists do that, postcolonial theorists do that. But I was like scared I was, you know, being cliche or something, wasn't sure like how to frame things. And I think that's something that we as economists need to unpack and like force ourselves to do more. And time is up. So thank you everyone for attending, and please stay in touch with us.
Thank you.
And, with Decon, please join us, and hope to see you tomorrow as well for the next session. Yeah.